This is From Justin to Kane, a podcast where Mike Robertson and Bob LaRue watch one critically acclaimed film and one terrible film and talk about how they are the same.
Hello. So for the part 2 of our Portrait of a Lady on Fire and Ready Player One episode, we have a special treat for you, our loyal canines.
We wanted to take a moment just in the middle of our normal programming to show you a conversation we had with a friend of Mike's, and now a friend of mine, I hope. David, I hope you like me. His name is David Barry. He's an author and a thinker, and he has a book called On Nostalgia, and he had a lot to say about Ready Player One and the idea of nostalgia and its place in art. So have a listen to this conversation.
So,
well, we should introduce David Barry and why he's here.
Yes. So this is David Barry. He's a published author who wrote the book On Nostalgia. Anything else you'd like to add, David, about your bio?
That is totally true. I've been like a critic for a while, like 10, 15 years. So, I never actually reviewed Ready Player One in any like thing, but I have seen it and I have hated it. So, I'm ready to go.
Before we get into it, can I ask what about nostalgia fascinates you?
Basically, because I was like mostly a film critic, but all kinds of critic for a while, like nostalgia kept coming up in two really specific ways. It was either like everyone complaining about how like, oh, another Star Wars movie. They're just, cashing in on everyone's nostalgia and this is terrible and everyone is dumb for buying this every single time. And then the other time it would come up is like in works of art, where it was always this like incredibly powerful, like, there's a lot of books and movies that are about nostalgia in a serious way. And it's usually like something deep and meaningful and, meaningful enough for someone to make like a 2-hour movie about it. Mm-hmm. Usually like ponderous and Polish or something, right? So it's like...
Oh, I was going to say for this episode that we're having you on, the two movies we covered for our podcast was Ready Player One and Portrait of a Lady on Fire. So it's about art in various incarnations. Like that movie's about a painting.
Mm-hmm. About getting a portrait done, yeah. Have you seen the film?
I have seen it. It's deeply, very romantic. Quite the pairing. I'm always impressed by your guys' pairings. So
it's like a fine wine.
Yeah. But yeah, basically to go back to nostalgia, I found it like really weird that like that was the two reactions everyone always had to nostalgia. Either like very deep and meaningful or just like the dumbest, crassest bullshit that we need to get rid of. And so it was something about that like weird tension. And I think what I realized is that in both of those instances, it kind of like shuts off our brain a bit, like it's something we just have this reaction to and we either like live in and sort of get swallowed by or just like disregard entirely. Usually when it's someone else's nostalgia, we just like, we think it is nonsense. So yeah, it seemed like something worth trying to think about a little harder for a while.
Fascinating.
Well, maybe like I just discovered who you were today, David. So I apologize. I'm not as well read as Mike is on your work, but I read an article you wrote that I think is an excerpt from the book. It was adapted, talking about like the root of the word nostalgia and where it came from historically, and then how it's like transformed into what we know it as today, which is something that's like very much prominent in our pop culture. But it started out as like a medical condition. Correct?
Yeah.
Or like it was deemed as one and it was for homesickness, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So like nostalgia is two Greek words, nostos and algia, which basically means homesickness or longing for home. Yeah. And so it was a 17th century, a Swiss physician. There was a lot of like Swiss mercenaries and servants and things like that who went out and they got this like, he thought he noticed this debilitating illness in them where they wanted to go home and they couldn't do anything until they were allowed to go home again. And it actually became like a weird like trait of the Swiss for a while for some reason. people thought of it. The German word for nostalgia for a while was like Schweizerwohrenkrankheit, which is like the Swiss illness.
Interesting.
Yeah,
but it wasn't just the Swiss getting homesick, I assume. Or is that unknown? Maybe it was just the Swiss.
I heard Switzerland is a great place, so I can see why they would be nostalgic for it.
Yeah,
of course. Well, I was just going to say that was actually part of why, like, the reason like Switzerland is still thought of as like this, like, you know, place to go for like spas and sanatoriums and stuff like that is partly due to this. Cause like the Swiss tried to be like, look, the reason we're all so sad when we're not in Switzerland is because Switzerland is like, it's the most healthful, wonderful place. Like anyone who leaves there just gets debilitated by how shitty and ugly everywhere else is. So like, come to Switzerland. Yeah.
And then it morphed from that, right, into like sort of its current iteration. But that happened in the mid 20th century, right, where it stopped being so much about homesickness and it became more about moments or about times in your life.
Yeah,
instead of a geographical thing.
Yeah, basically, like kind of the end of the 19th, beginning of the early 20th century, people stopped really considering it a disease, mostly because like no one could cure it and no one knew what to do with it, so they gave up on it.
Mm-hmm.
And then basically we had the word homesickness for a while, which described homesickness, but as like home became less of like a physical place,
right?
Homesickness kind of just didn't really capture what we were actually trying to convey, really. So nostalgia kind of like wormed its way in. Basically, in the 50s and 60s is when it started to become like a popular term outside of like more specialist books. And then in the 70s, there was like a huge nostalgia boom, things calling themselves nostalgia magazines and shit like that. And then basically from then on, it just became part of our culture to the point where, no one really thinks about it as weird anymore.
In terms of movies, in the 70s was like the time of George Lucas kind of coming to the forefront and like altering the way that movies are seen in terms of like blockbusters becoming really huge in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And then also his first big hit was American Graffiti, which was like a nostalgia bomb for like calling back to the 50s. And then Star Wars was just like a regurgitation of his old serials, like the old space serials and stuff. So yeah, it seems like the 70s was kind of a good turning point. And then I guess, Reagan being elected shortly after, I'm sure has some sort of connection as well.
He was like a nostalgic decision in a way because he was such a like suave 1930s leading man. And then he became the president of the United States.
People are just really nostalgic for Bedtime for Bonzo, like monkey companion films.
Aren't we all?
They got something much worse. I guess similar to how we're all nostalgic for the Apprentice, and now look at us.
I believe his first running mate was a chimpanzee, and then then they switched to George H.W. Bush. Yeah.
So, with Ready Player One, like in your mind, is that film? For me, it really feels like just a movie that's entirely built on nostalgia. Like the artistic merit, if it has, it has some, I suppose. It's very creative in how it reuses what we remember from pop culture.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, is it creatively noble to be like, I want to like shine a light on everything we've ever experienced in the last 30 years in the like video game world, the movie world, and the television world, and like condense it into a novel and then have that turn into a movie? Is there a world where that works?
Well, I think like in a weird way, Ready Player One is just kind of like a concentrated version of what makes shitty art, because like all art is kind of reference, right? Like,
yes.
Everything you do is referencing something, but like most of the time you kind of hide the seams, or at the very least, like even like someone like Tarantino, who's obviously like deeply referential, is usually like being mildly obscure. Like it feels like, not that obscurity is like a measure of quality or anything, but just like the things come from a place where it's just like, holy shit, like this guy has watched every movie that's been made from 1960 on kind of thing. And he's picking up on some like weird background thing, that and like working it in. Whereas like the problem with Ready Player One, the reason why it seems so obviously nostalgic, I think, is that all the references are just like what you would get if you, flip through a copy of Rolling Stone, or, just like if you picked up the front page of an entertainment section for the biggest newspaper in the country for 30 years, that's like, those are the references. There is nothing weird or arcane. Even the like nerd culture things are the most obvious. Like, I don't feel like I'm a nerd in the way that Ready Player One likes nerdery. Mm-hmm. And I knew all of the shit that they were talking about, and like that I think is what really makes it like it. There's this deeply ironic thing that it's about this place where you can go where like the sky is the limit. And the only thing anyone can do is like live in 1980s pop culture.
Yeah.
It's so perfect.
Well, but I think the story or the concept is fundamentally flawed because like the character would have to cast their obsession with all of these pop culture properties aside in order to like change as like a character. Like the character arc would mean that they would end up in a different place, but they end up celebrating it just as much by the end.
Yeah.
And they're just like, oh, the world isn't saved. We're still in this kind of dystopia, but now there's more. We can just be in pop culture, and this corporation isn't in charge of all of this corporate intellectual property, I guess, is like the story, which is kind of nonsense.
Especially coming from a blockbuster movie. But,
if it came out 100 years from today and it was the exact same film that it is, but that's when it was released, would it be good? Like, is time the issue, or is it just a poorly, like, would it just not work?
That's an interesting question. Well, because like at least then, even if like say it came out in 2018, but all the references were to like late Victorian drama, it might still feel like a little weird or something, but it would at least seem like clever, right? Like you weren't just like hoovering up the refuse of consumer culture. And
wow, what a phrase! Holy shit!
Yeah,
I love that.
That's why you get paid the big bucks to write the words.
That's why you're a big get.
That's why you're a big get, because you speak in good ways.
What did you say before the Zoom call, Mike? You said he says it good, or he writes it good.
I think I said the same joke. He says words good.
Yeah,
because we were just marveling over the quality of the words, I guess. Just how eloquent it read, and how it wasn't impenetrable, but it still seemed. Yes, yeah. This is when you're trying to talk about words, you just kind of end up just sounding like a dum-dum.
It was approachably intellectual.
Yes. Wow. Thank you.
It was very like grounded and consumable, yet I felt smart afterwards.
You said it in 2 words, Bob, where I couldn't even get it in like 10. So
that's why we're a good team. That's
Mike.
Right. Okay. Well, interesting. I wanted to ask, this isn't so much about the film, but like nostalgia, is there something debilitating about nostalgia? Because if the article I read sort of like alluded to that people are craving it now, it's something they're longing for in media and what they consume. But if you're only looking back and reconsuming what you've already experienced or dealt with, doesn't that sort of like, boy, this is going to get existential, but doesn't that just like lock you in the same place? Whether it's creatively or like in your life, if you're just constantly looking back at that thing you once did or had and you're longing for that again?
I think so for sure. And nostalgia is kind of this like extra trap, because if you go deep enough into it, it becomes its own essential fantasy world, right? Like, which is kind of another reason why Ready Player One works so well. Cause it's like, like, this is someone's nostalgia, like turned into a literal fantasy world, basically. But so like the problem is though too, is that it becomes a fantasy world that has this weird sheen of historical accuracy or legitimacy to it. Right. And so it's like, you can tell yourself that you're not actually completely divorced from reality in any way because, oh, well, these things happened. They actually happened to me or something like that. And so like, I think for the most part, most people's nostalgia is relatively fleeting and is like a pretty good and important thing for like, we feel shitty. We think about a time when we felt good and we feel good again and it helps us move on. But like, definitely if you miss that step of like actually using what you're thinking about to try to improve your situation, then yeah, you just get caught in this death spiral. And I think you're like, yeah, exactly right. And like, that's where these kind of complaints about, say, corporate nostalgic culture, where, you know, it's just like, we just have a new Star Wars movie every year. It feels like, I don't know if it's actually true. They might be a $1 billion industry till like 150 years past we're us being dead. But like, it feels like they've just like sort of ran out of ideas and are just like rehashing whatever the hell they think will buy, because they can't move forward. They can't make a fun space opera movie unless it's got Star Wars. Like,
yeah, on the topic of what Bob and you guys were talking, because I was just sitting here listening to your sultry tones of your voice. Yeah. Yeah. Just the modern concept of adulting is a thing where people like the millennials, I guess, are rewarding themselves for acting like their parents would have wanted them to act, like probably 15 years prior to that, you know? We're so bombarded with the culture of our youth that we kind of feel like we can still live as children in adult bodies.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, for sure.
When we're forced with adult responsibilities, then it's like, we're like, oh, we're an adult now. I've transitioned, even though I'm 37 or whatever.
Right. Yeah. I think there's kind of two weird, like, twin things going on there. Again, both of which oddly speak to Ready Player One, which, like, a terrible movie is such a rich text for this shit. It's amazing.
I love how cohesive you're keeping this interview, though.
Yeah, I keep derailing it and getting existential, and you're like, yeah, but Ready Player One.
But anyway, to bring it back to you, yeah.
You're doing our job for us. Thank you. What a get.
What a get.
But so it's like part of what's going on there is that, like, modern life is deeply alienating. And I think you could argue, like, especially for millennials, like, you don't need to rehash all the shit about how, like, oh, they've come into a recession and now a pandemic and all this shit. And like, they don't, the kind of adulthood that their parents present to them as obvious, just like hasn't seemed to be in any way accessible to us. Mm-hmm. And like nostalgia, since it stopped being a disease, has kind of been thought of as like the ultimate response to the alienation of modern life, basically, right? It's like, modern life separates us from ourselves. So like we fall back to the past to try to regain this sense of humanity. But then the flip side to that too is like our childhoods are accessible to us in a way that like possibly no other generations were. Like, like even seeing a movie, like when I was born in the mid 80s, if you wanted to see a movie a second time, hopefully the theater was showing it again. And maybe you had like a laser disc or a VHS player, maybe. But like even those were kind of like widespread a little later.
The VHSs came out like a year or two later sometimes, which was wild to think about because now it's like they release movies on demand the same day that it comes out in the theater a lot of the time.
Yeah, exactly. I can watch a movie on my phone whenever I want now forever, right? Like, and like even with like digital things, but even like physical copies of things, like if my grandmother wanted to see the doll she had when she was a kid, like hopefully she kept it, or maybe she could have like made another shitty one from like whatever spare parts that her grandmother made the doll from. But like, if I want the G.I. Joe that I played with when I was 7, maybe I can't get the same one, but I can get one that was like made in the same plastic mold or something, right? Like it's just like our personal histories are around us in a way that I don't think any other generation has ever experienced. And that kind of feels like, yeah, of course we're going to be children. Like no one has ever forced us to give it up in a way that anyone else did, Like,
would you say that it is still a sickness then? in that regards? Because like I'm skeptical of like overly nostalgic stuff where, I don't like how the movies these days are all just things. Like they announced some animation block on TV that was just all cartoons from the 90s, I think. Beavis and Butthead's coming back, Ren and Stimpy maybe.
Yeah.
Something else. And so it's like, this is terrible. Like they're not going to be as good as we remember them being, but then also it's why even bother?
Can I throw a theory out there?
Please.
What is it possible that with pop culture, specifically like younger generations most of a childhood was consumed by pop culture as like your memories. Like you spent time like playing video games, you spent time I don't know, digging bands, watching TV, watching movies, doing all this shit. You had posters on the walls. Your parents didn't have posters on their walls. They didn't have the same things to occupy their childhood. But I also feel like there's an expiration date on pop culture that's getting shorter. So like maybe this is just a real wild stab in the dark, but like people are still reading Charles Dickens or like Herman Melville or like, you know, old fucking books. But I feel like there's an exhaustion or like an expiration date to things that happen later. And that's why they're like being re-released or reinvented. It's to like maintain this relevancy or something. I don't know. I think like there's a shelf life on Star Wars that there isn't on Moby Dick. You know what I mean?
Well, but like, I wonder about that though, because
or is
like,
that true? I don't know.
Well, that like goes to your point before about like, if, you know, Ready Player One was released 100 years from now, right? Like, would it seem like an incredible work of art? And there is like, the weird truth of it is, I think it just depends on what survives, right? Like,
yeah,
there are all kinds of crazy things that were like huge in whenever the 20s or 30s or whatever that no one gives a shit about today because, you know, like now we actually appreciate John Steinbeck or something, right? Like,
yeah.
And so like, yeah, like it just depends whether Star Wars kicks around or not. And I like, maybe I'd argue that the relentless strip mining of it like seems to diminish. Like, I can't speak for you guys, but like, I would be perfectly fine never fucking seeing another Star Wars movie.
Where there's diminishing returns on every fucking try. Like, and I think the globe is getting exhausted. Yeah, you know, I think there's like just like a general apprehension now.
They should have stopped after the first two. Like, they should have made Star Wars, and then they should have made Star Wars Christmas special, and then they're done.
The two perfect films, and then the rest of them
were the only good ones. Yeah, those are the only canon that I care about. Is
Star Wars Christmas? What a joy! What a joy!
To go back to what you were saying before, Mike, I just think too, like, in terms of that idea of it still being a disease, having like wrestled with it for a long time, I think the difference is like like our personal nostalgia, the nostalgia, like that is very essential and crucial for us, like understanding who we are. Whereas like nostalgia that people are trying to indulge for us is almost always universally bad. Like no one who is doing that has a good reason for doing that. They're trying to manipulate you, and we should be suspicious of it.
So you're saying that the Murphy Brown reboot was...
although that was a victory for feminism. That one was just like, you know, finally Murphy Brown is going to... No, yeah, it's like...
I read this book. This is I guess, somewhat tied to nostalgia. I just read that book, Chaos, about the Manson murders and how it might be tied to the MK Ultra experiments.
Right.
It's like a real rabbit hole book, but they do talk about the Manson murders quite a bit. And because people talk about that as like, it was when the 60s ended, man. Like, it was a beautiful, powerful time of love and whatever. And then when that happened, it kind of revealed that we were lying to ourselves, maybe. But then also, Candice Bergen was living in the house at one point prior to when the Manson murders happened. So it's weird to think of that when you watch Murphy Brown. That's what I was trying to get to. I took a little detour to make it about the book, but also
that was wow. Anyway,
yeah.
I totally forgot we started at Murphy Brown until you brought back Candice Bergen. I was like,
yeah. Well, it's kind of weird when you watch Murphy Brown. You're like, she was like very affected by those murders. So, but that's also Bob likes that Quentin Tarantino movie that came out last year.
Oh, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Yeah. I didn't care for it, but I think it's because I was like, oh, he seems to be kind of stomping through that well-trodden idea that, yeah, the 60s kind of like there was something beautiful and wonderful about that before the murders happened, you know?
So, yeah.
But it's like, no, it was always bad. Like America, if you look back now and you can be like, yeah, it's always terrible. Like it's still tainted by the Civil War. It's still tainted by slavery. We're kind of seeing that now in a beautiful but terrifying way.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, it's such a weird, like, it's like MLK was assassinated in 1968. There were like riots. Like, it's like Vietnam was ongoing the whole fucking time. Like, what are you guys talking about? But like, yeah, it's like, no. It was this one hippie in the Hollywood Hills who killed one kind of famous person. Anyway, like, yeah. It feels like very well. I think that's part of, actually, not to ramble too far here, but like the reason I'm a little suspicious of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood too is that like, yeah, it's like for Quentin Tarantino, whose entire frame of reference is what happens in Hollywood, then like, yes, that was 60s over, but he didn't really convince me that he can view the world without those blinders, I guess. Is not to, I'm sure there are plenty of other things to hammer Quentin Tarantino on, like his weird foot thing, but that's neither here.
That was also, that was the thing that Bob loved about it too. He loved the foot thing because he shares that fetish.
Wow, Mike, way to out me. Oh my goodness.
Also, Bob got his 2 ribs removed. That's not for this podcast.
That's for our other podcast.
Sorry, Bob. I know you two just met. I shouldn't.
It's okay.
It's good.
Have you guys ever had, being, pop culture aficionados yourself, be like, how anytime you search an actress's name, like the second thing is always feet. It's like, it's like Margot Robbie feet, Margot Robbie age, Margot Robbie husband or something. Just like foot fetish people are thirsty as shit. Like,
they're prolific.
Yes.
On the internet. I think there's a professional dedication to Googling feet.
I haven't noticed that myself, but I'm aware of that culture through Twitter because a lot of like the female comedians that I follow will also talk about their wiki feet profiles because they're aware that they are being kind of tracked or stalked in that way, which is terrifying.
What's wiki feet?
Oh, Bob, don't act like you don't know.
No, I don't. What is that? Is it like LinkedIn for feet?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Well,
like you to make a profile and you're like, these are my feet. Here's my foot resume.
Yes.
Look at them.
No, it's like people basically will make a website for usually a woman, and it's like a celebrity, and they make a profile, and it's just pictures of their feet. So it's like,
and it's not, they're not the host of it. It's like third party people.
No. Yeah. Of course.
All the foot folks making domain names and stuff.
I guess I don't want to take up too much more of your time, David, but we've got a couple more little questions. One thing that I was kind of wanted to just get your opinion on was, we're doing a podcast looking back on old movies and kind of recontextualizing them by kind of smashing them together and trying to think about things in different ways. But like podcasts as a medium, if you go on the internet and just look at all of the new podcasts that come out, like there's just so many things, and it just seems like it's over analyzing things as niche as it gets,
Yeah.
Where they're just like, we're going to go through every single episode of this television show by this one creator, and that's our whole podcast concept or whatever,
Right.
Oh yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm not really that into. I don't know. Like, I can't think of many people who I would care at all to listen to even like one podcast episode detailing their career, let alone like a series. But then I don't know, like maybe I'm not the audience. Like there's probably some, but to me that it seemed just like this weird elevation of fan culture-y kind of thing where it's like, you can no longer just like, well, yeah, I like the Coen brothers. I'll go see a Coen brothers movie when it comes out. Of course. It's like, no. My life is the Coen brothers. My cats are named Joel and Ethan. And it's like this full on thing. And it's just like, I don't know, like, which isn't to take, maybe I'd listen to a Paul Verhoeven podcast. I don't know.
Oh, nice.
But no, but like, I also just think, and like, this is revealing my bias is what I try to do is that like, it's way more interesting to try to piece together pop culture, smash it together to see what it's actually trying to say, as opposed to just being like, yeah, Quentin Tarantino has a foot fetish. And it was 34 hours of us discussing anyway. But like, yeah, I don't know. I don't like to read biographies. I don't like to read memoirs or, it's like, I just like, that's not what I'm in it for. And I like the broad histories. I like the, context. That's what I'm after.
Yeah, it's interesting because you said, yeah, if I'm watching this movie or whatever, it's my life. Like, I feel like that so much of pop culture is tied to identity nowadays, where people's identity is like, I'm a gamer or I'm this kind of nerd, you know?
Yeah.
You offend me with you not being of my kind, that being some made up identity that I am just putting all of my eggs in that basket for some reason.
Yeah. And even like more so even than just pop culture, but like pop cultural criticism seems to be hiving off into these weird, like some of them are just terrible fan things, but some of them are like these very weird, narrow, like almost academic style, like, and here's a Marxist reading of, fucking Brooklyn Nine-Nine or whatever. And it's like, all right, great, cool. Like, I don't know. It's just like, it seems to be this narrowing that does not interest me at all.
What would it be like if our parents did that kind of thing? Like, this is a Marxist reading of Matlock. Like, would it kind of have the same kind of traction?
Well, if our parents did that, they'd get tenure at, an Ivy League school. And
true.
Yeah. So.
And then cut to 30 years later and we're all adjunct professors and we can't get that sweet tenure track.
No, that's why we have to start all these podcasts. It's just like, come on,
exactly. Oh, interesting. It's the poor man's academia in a way. I never thought about it. We're scholars, Bob.
Yeah, well, absolutely.
Somebody's
got
to do it.
You heard it here first, folks. Yeah. Cool. Any other thoughts or questions, Bob, you had?
Well, I feel like we should talk about, obviously, Ready Player One is overtly nostalgic, but we should briefly talk about Portrait of a Lady on Fire, just so.
Nice.
And Mike and I were just chatting. We were like, that's not really like a nostalgic movie, but in a way it is. It's like made very romantically about an era that is bygone.
Yeah.
And it's also about a portrait being taken. And I was like, the portrait then is like what tattoos are today, which it's just like a symbol made for posterity, but also to remind you of what you once had or were once doing.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I want to, what are your thoughts? Do you remember the film well? Portrait of a Lady on Fire? You probably haven't seen it for a while.
Relatively. I saw it I think it was maybe the last movie I saw in theaters before everything went to hell. So, it feels like it was 15 years ago. But like, cause isn't it framed slightly by like the woman remember? No. She just shows up. Yeah. Well, yeah. So
it's in the art class at the beginning.
Right. Yeah.
She is remembering, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So there you go. Like, that's kind of if Ready Player One is like the crass commercial nostalgia that is like eating us alive, like Portrait of a Lady on Fire is the actual like deep, meaningful nostalgia, this overwhelming sense of like wanting to return to this kind of not even perfect moment, but just like deeply meaningful moment. Like, obviously this woman carries that person with her forever. And naturally she would want that to come back from time to time, like she's still moving on. She's teaching art classes and stuff like that. But like, of course she's going to be like stopped in her tracks and want to go back to that, And I think that's the good suckering nature of nostalgia too, is that like, if you don't have these moments, like what are you really to make it existential too? Right. Like, you are what you remember essentially.
God, you're good, David. Wow. Holy shit. Cool.
Well, I mean, you've been doing, I've read some interviews with you about this book. I'm very excited to actually read it. But do you think that one day you will be nostalgic for the time when you
wrote a book?
We're constantly talking about nostalgia. Like, will you look back on this time as just like, oh yeah, when I had to talk about this a lot? Because there will be a time when you're not talking about nostalgia every day.
Right. Ideally not, actually. Ideally, I'll just like be talking about nostalgia forever until, this will sell like Stephen King levels and I'll just be the fucking nostalgia guy from here on out.
That's awesome.
Be dressed exactly like this. And no, the weird thing is this is going to be tied up with all this COVID shit. And like, as much as I know that I will be nostalgic for this, cause like, we can't help it. People were nostalgic for the Depression. They were nostalgic for the Blitz. Like, it's, it's like, but right now I just want to say, it's like, no, I'm going to be so happy when this is all fucking over.
Yeah. But yeah, I guess I never thought about it that way, that, this was I mean, this is a trying time for everybody, but yeah, it sucks to have like your first kind of success like this dampened by this. Not to be a downer or anything, but
No.
yeah. But also, it's interesting because it's going to be like a lens that you have to look back at your past through. Like, oh yeah, remember when my book came out and it's like exciting and fun time, but then also I couldn't hug people.
Erase that part I said about memoirs earlier, and in like 40 years, I'll write a memoir of letting a nostalgia go book in the midst of all this. And what does it say? Anyway, yeah.
And
that shit could win a Governor General's Award.
Well, this is like a weird time too, because people are, you go to the top movies of the year are Jurassic Park and like Terminator 2 and stuff. And like, it's like a time for people to delve back into what makes them feel safe.
Yeah, for sure.
I guess when the first couple of weeks when we're all just like, we're not allowed to leave the house at all. So we all just watch stuff. And I'm sure most people just kind of watch stuff they were comfortable with. I know Bob did. He watched a lot of rom-coms.
What are you talking about, Mike? I'm not a foot guy. I'm a rom-com guy. That's my dirty secret. I love rom-coms.
Might as well be rom-com. Yeah, anyway. Yeah.
Your next book should be on rom-coms.
Oh, rom-coms. There you go. The great thing about that title is it works for whatever subject. No confusion, straight to the point. You know?
It is interesting, Mike, that like as this pandemic happened, because like wasn't it like Netflix always shows you like what's top 10 the week of or whatever, and like I'm pretty sure for the first month it was just like it would be like Jurassic Park, Scent of a Woman, Contagion. Well, that's less nostalgia and more just like I'm afraid of something. I want to be more afraid of it, so I'm going to watch this thing that's really triggering. That's why people watch that shit. But it was a lot of like 90s shit. It was like a lot of Spielberg movies. And I was guilty of that. I watched a lot of that stuff. I was watching, like, I didn't watch a lot of new movies. Now I'm starting to do that because we have this like new normal. But yeah, that first month, I feel like everyone just like reverted to the 90s.
Well, but so here's the really weird thing. As obvious as like now, like, of course, people are going to be all nostalgic now and like watching their favorites. Like, I think it was in the year 2018 or 2019. It's that this is in the book, but like The Office accounted for like 8% of all Netflix viewing was people rewatching The American Office. And like with Friends, I think it was like 14 or 15% alone was just people watching. People watched enough Office for every single US subscriber to have watched 2 full seasons of it. So it's like Netflix is partly this nostalgia machine for sure. Like, because it's just like you're overwhelmed by choice and it'll be like, hey, watch this again. And you'll be like, sure. And you start and then it just keeps auto playing it. And you're like, well, I'm 2 seasons in now. I better watch the whole thing again. And
I think all the streaming services are doing that, right? Like Disney with their animations, like you can watch all their old school shit on Disney Plus. Yeah, I think streaming's massive just because accessibility is right in front of you.
Well, also, it's all kind of AI based too, because they use algorithms to figure out what we're interested in. But if we just watch old stuff, then Netflix is like, well, the algorithm's saying this thing is good, so let's remake this show, which makes sense. But it's also kind of the computers aren't smart enough to know that we want something new that's like that. They're just like, no, let's just make something similar.
Right. They need Steve Jobs to be like, I'll tell you what you want to watch.
Exactly. I want someone to tell me what to watch. Yeah.
I know what you want before you know what you want. And anyway, there you go.
It's interesting when you were talking about the Netflix thing, Bob, about how they had all of just the different movies that were from the 90s. Well, I was going to say, like, once things kind of happened in a couple of months past or whatever, and now we're in the new normal, which is people being mad about masks, and masks is the big talking point. Why is the mask not trending? Or Son of the Mask, I guess.
Oh, shit. Good
Why
question.
Isn't the 1980s cartoon mask not trending? Like,
yes.
No, that doesn't show up in Ready Player One. Anyway, I was trying to bring it back.
The Cher movie with Eric Stoltz, Mask, that's not in Ready Player One either.
Can you imagine? They have like heart-wrenching dramas and like people are picking avatars from just like the most depressing dramatic films of the
Schindler's
80s.
List, the girl with like the red coat or whatever.
Yeah. Oh my God. You're like driving like a race car and trying to get money or whatever. Oh, that'd be crazy. But also, it's all nostalgia, right?
See, that's art. That's the Ready Player One. That's art.
It'd be cool to see like Eraserhead, the David Lynch film, like that character in the Ready Player One universe. Like somebody picks. I mean, there'd be cinephiles playing the game who like, you know, are these really niche characters. I don't know. Like I can see it happening. That's a fault of Spielberg and the author. That's on them.
Agreed.
Well, thanks for being on the pod.
For sure. Thanks for
really appreciate it. Where can we get your book? Where can people find your book and buy it?
Is available at all your favorite online outlets. You know, I don't know where you're listening to this from, but you know, Indigo, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. The best way to buy it, though, of course, is from either your local independent bookseller or the Coach House Books website itself, which is just search for Coach House Books on Google. And the second thing will be Coach House Books feet. And there you go. Click that link and you're good. No, but seriously, Coach House Books, buy it direct from there. It's a wonderful place.
Nice. Yeah, I ordered it from Coach House and the shipping was virtually free and it arrives very fast.
That's great. In these COVID times, you can never trust the mail unless they're sending you books, right? So exactly,
yeah. Well, thanks so much. And is there a website and a wiki feed that you have that you would like to promote?
Wiki feed. My wiki feed is David Wiki feed. No, my website is thedavidbarry.com, but the Instagram is @onnostalgia, and my Twitter is Pleasure Motors.
Right. Yes.
People always like to have a one word for everything, and I'm like, no. Let's confuse people.
Your Instagram is very active.
Well, I find relentless self-promotion these days. So,
yeah, it's good. It's entertaining.
It's my only escape from child rearing.
Well, thank you very much for being on the pod. We really appreciate it. We're excited to read the book.
Yeah. Thanks, David. And it's nice meeting you too.
Nice to meet you too. I look forward to listening to the episode now. Not my parts, like the other parts of the episode.
Do you want us to send you a supercut of just you speaking? we can do that for you.
Maybe just like all my like stutters and ums, like.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah. We definitely we do that big time. So, oh yeah.
I personally edit every episode and I cut out all of my weird vocal tics.
And then he leaves mine in to make him look better.
I leave Bob's in because they don't irritate me. Only mine irritate me for some reason. I don't know why.
Yeah, thanks so much, David.
Thank you guys.
Thanks.
Super fun. Hopefully I'll see you in real life at some point in the next 3 years.
That's the dream.
Yeah. Okay. See you.
All right, see you.
Bye.
So that was our conversation with David Barry. Please buy his book. He's very thoughtful, very funny. He's intelligent, as you just heard. He is smarter than Mike and I. I mean,
by a long shot. Yeah,
he was a good guest. What a get!
What a great first guest, don't you think?
Yeah. So we'll try to keep guests coming as well.
Yeah.
I think that's the end of this episode. We felt that conversation was kind of a nice way to wrap up the whole conversation between Portrait of a Lady on Fire and Ready Player One.
Yeah, David's comments really spelled out how those movies are the same movie, which is the conceit of the podcast. All right, thanks for listening, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, everyone, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Be sure to go and check out our social media profiles. We got Twitter. We got Instagram. Email us at fromjustintokane@gmail.com. All of those words are words. None of them's the number 2. But all of our social media has the number 2 as instead of the word 2, if that makes sense. I think that was clear. And then also, inspired by our conversation with Dave, we're going to also start From Justin to Kane wiki feet profile. So come and check out our profile. It's like the only place to get sweet official From Justin to Kane fetish pics of me and Bob's feet.
Yeah, and you can guess whose feet is whose, and we'll try to keep that updated. We'll probably post more often on that than we do our actual podcast. So
Yeah.
buckle up. I'm going to be spearheading that project.
We're just going to transition from a podcast to just purely going into wiki feet.
Yeah, and we'll have photos of our feet for sale as well on our website.
Yeah.
So enjoy.
That's
all I can say.
Yeah.
Bon appetit.
Try and guess whose foot is who, because we're both lank lords and we both probably have very similar looking feet.
What size are your feet, Mike?
11.
And mine are 9. So
oh, really? Your feet are smaller than I expected.
I got little baby shrimp feet. Yeah.
You totally do have cute little baby shrimp feet.
You heard it here, folks. Mike thinks my baby shrimp feet are cute. I will say, let me just get this off my chest. The feet are are my least favorite part of the human body, and that's why I love them.
Oh, I see.
I have a complicated relationship with them.
I was wondering where that was going. Anyway, thanks for listening to the episode, everybody.
Yeah. Oh, fuck. All right. We've been from Justin to feet, and we'll see you next week.
See ya. Bye. Good stuff.
Oh, shit.